What's up, Duke fans? Welcome to the Devil's Den podcast. I'm your host, Josh Smith, joined by co-host Raul. We're happy to welcome in Dr. Evan Miyakawa. Dr. Evan Miyakawa. Am I pronouncing it right? I
That
want to
is
make
correct.
sure.
Yep.
Okay, very nice. So this kind of came up on a whim here a little bit, but we're happy to do this. So most of our listeners are probably going to be pretty familiar with your work, Evan, but first off the top though, like I want to nerd out just a little bit. We're going to do some Duke specific stuff, but just how did you really kind of find this? Like, when did this become a passion? When did basketball? And just kind of talk to us a little bit about your jump into this analytical storm.
You guys are going to love my origin story here. So I mentioned before we started airing here that I'm in Indianapolis. That's partly because I grew up here in Indianapolis. I was a big Butler Bulldogs fan growing up. Lived about 10 minutes from Hinkle Fieldhouse, and I was at Hinkle Fieldhouse watching the Butler Michigan State semifinal game in 2010, I think. And right after that game was finished and Butler went to the title game against Duke, my dad and I drove downtown and bought 2 tickets off of fans who weren't going to the final. So I was at that game, the Butler-Duke game, the famous Gordon Hayward half-court shot. So obviously sad for me that Duke won that game, but a very fundamental memory for me that kind of cemented college basketball as being my favorite sport that I watched and cover. And so fast forward, my background is in stats and sports analytics. I got my undergrad in mathematics. I went on to get my PhD in statistics at Baylor. And while I was in school, I was just sort of trying to apply what I was learning in school to college basketball and to sports in general, because it just felt like such a natural kind of extension for me of applying data and quantifying something that I was like caring about and thinking about on a daily basis. And so that's sort of how I started my website, EvanMiya.com. It was sort of just a fun side project while I was in grad school. I wasn't planning on it becoming anything big. But then it sort of started to just organically grow, and it was being used by coaches were figuring out about it. Journalists were starting to reference it. Fans were getting into it. And so I ended up working for a while for a sports analytics company where I worked with NBA teams in their front offices doing analytics. But my website just sort of organically grew to the point where it was doing well enough that I could actually sink my teeth into it and go full time. So I've been doing that full time for about 2 years, which has been such a blessing from the Lord. It truly is a dream job and not something I was expecting to happen, but it's been really cool to see. And so, I mean, as you guys are aware of, but it's used by a lot of coaches for roster building, game scouting, things like that. And it's very popular with fans and people in media for team and player performance, lineup analysis, transfer portal projections, all sorts of stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think too, and I'm going to jump around a little bit, fellas, just for sake of time here. I want to go a little more broad, a little more general. I think early on it was kind of a fan's nerdy dream, right? Especially for podcasters, for analytics. If you're a baseball guy, you've been well versed in analytics. Like, baseball kind of takes this thing to an absurd level with where they go. But I think now we're starting to see the coaches really kind of bite into this stuff, and even having like managers and scouter and like own like analytical like departments, and they're using it to scout guys. I mean, Cedric Coward was a big one for us last summer of, Duke, Nate Oates, and Alabama were really kind of like analytical darling here. Clearly they're not the only ones that were tapping into that stuff, but for you, Evan, what has that kind of been like, seeing the new wave of coaches? Not that all the old heads were tuned out on it, but I think the buy-in is much heavier now. What has that been like, and kind of like how is that translated to what we're seeing kind of at the level of play?
Yeah, I mean, every new generation of coaches that are kind of rising up the ranks have more and more of an appetite for analytics. And it's not just like this like magic superpower. It's really about like my view is that your most informed opinion on college sports, or really any field that touches data in any way, your most informed place is if you're striking a balance between leveraging your own eye test, your own expert knowledge. So if you're talking about a coach, like your own understanding of the game, what you're seeing with your eyes, and you marry that with objective, data-driven analysis of stuff that's explaining things in a way that you may not be able to fully like capture or pay attention to, And you shouldn't just only use the eye test and not use the data at all. You should also just not blindly trust the data and ignore what you think is happening. You put them together, and that puts you in the most accurate place. And so the programs that are being the most successful with analytics are the ones who are doing that well, of saying like, hey, I think this is what I'm seeing, or think this is what I'm looking for. And then I'm going to consult sources like mine at EvanMiya.com or other places to see like, hey, does this agree with what I'm thinking? Does this not agree? And it helps move you to a more accurate understanding of what's going on, and ultimately making smarter decisions. That's the goal at the end of the day, is to make smarter decisions. I think the most obvious place that that's applied in today's college basketball landscape is recruiting, and specifically recruiting through the transfer portal, because we have all this data on how these players are playing college. It does take a lot of, it's a bit of guesswork to just watch a guy in film and say, hey, I think this is how this guy is going to translate coming from this conference and this team to my conference and my team. But you can actually use data to help you, become a lot more accurate in your understanding of that. And so I think programs like Duke are doing a really great job with that. Certainly a lot of these younger head coaches and assistant coaches and guys who are working their way up are really leveraging it. And so it's been really cool to see.
Go ahead,
Are
Raul.
there specific things that you could point to that teams should be looking at when they are scouting players for the portal, to see whether they'll translate? Because we've seen that having great stats at a mid-major doesn't necessarily translate. So are there some other specific things that teams should key in on in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of what I have done at EvanMiya.com, is when you look at a player in my transfer portal projections, that's basically what it's saying, is looking at a player's whole body of work, the stats that they put up, their impact on team performance, the level of competition that they've played, their recruiting profile coming out of high school, how much potential they're supposed to have, the level that they played in their conference, all that stuff. What does all that tell us about what level of player this should be kind of at, regardless of which team they're playing for? Just how do they stack up nationally? And that's really what's all baked into that projection. So my high level answer is just go to look at my website. But from a like what goes into that, what's really important, the thing that I've often identified is, I think a lot of coaching staffs are very allured by getting someone who can score a lot, who can get a bucket, right? I want bucket getters on the court. That's very important. But a lot of times the guys that I see that do not succeed very well in going up a level from, say, the MAC to the ACC are guys who scored 17, 18 points per game and were the biggest shot volume guys on their team, but then didn't really do a lot else outside of that. They weren't making plays for others. They weren't consistent on the defensive end. They weren't able to get rebounds. They just really had the scoring thing, and that's what they were asked to do, so that's what they did. And a lot of times it's these guys who struggle the most going up a level, because when you all of a sudden are playing against much more athletic players, better defensive schemes, and they take away your comfortability as a scorer, you don't have anything else left to contribute. But it's the guys who can score, yes, but also are multidimensional in other ways. Like, okay, if you take away the scoring, they're able to pass the ball well, or they're able to defend the rim really well, or they're able to, that sort of stuff. Those are the guys who end up being excelling. So that's often a general trait that I'm looking for to seeing who's going to succeed in going up a level.
Yeah, and I think too, to tie it all in, something that I've been kind of tracking and interested in is just the level of play that we're seeing, and sort of the death of the mid-major a little bit with the roster construction flexibility that some of these coaches have. Obviously for Duke fans, we had a really great year last year and ended up in a Final Four with all one seeds with like historic level efficiency ratings that we're starting to see across the board. And I'm interested when I'm looking at these portal rankings. I'm looking at these individual. Could you just talk a little bit? I'm going to ask you to kind of jump into the coach's seat just a tad. How do you take these individual player metrics and then transpose it into like, okay, here's my best 5 lineup, or here's my best 3. What does that look like? Like, how do I then transform that into something meaningful? I think that just speaks to what some of these young coaches are doing, but curious your thoughts on any of that.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of answer your first question, I think the explanation for why we're having more, the gap between the very best teams in the sport and the rest of the sport is becoming bigger than ever. It really just boils down to one thing. It's the accumulation of talent is becoming even more just focused on that area. That if you take, here are the best players going to be in college basketball this season, the large bulk of them are now in, those top 50 programs in the country, as opposed to 5-10 years ago when it was a little bit more dispersed. And again, that's just because of the transfer portal, name, image, and likeness, and the fact that guys are able to pursue, more monetary value and things like that, transferring instead of staying with their program. When it comes to translating like the individual player numbers to team success or best lineups, that's really where it becomes really interesting. Generally speaking, it's like you just put your best 5 players on the court positionally and otherwise. But a lot of times when you go more into the lineup data that I have on my site, you can actually find it's like, hey, that my goal as a coach is to set my players up for success as best I can. So if I have a guy and I think he's supposed to be a valuable part of my rotation, I want to be putting him on the court with other players who are going to help him play to his best level of basketball. And that is not always obvious, right, when you just put those players on paper. Sometimes it takes getting into a season and actually looking at the data of, okay, how does this guy perform when he's on the court with this player or with this player or with this group of 3, or the team is really good when you have this trio of players together and they're really bad when you have this trio of players together. Even though all those guys are good players, something's not working with this combination. So instead of just not playing those guys, we're going to reshuffle and optimize more like, hey, we're going to put this guy in situations where we know that he's playing well, and not put him in situations where he's not playing well. And if you can just tweak those things, it's even just shuffling your lineups around, it can end up just optimizing how your team is playing, because it allows for you to put all of your best guys in their best spots. And so it's at this time of year, especially where we're a little bit more than halfway through the season and teams are comfortably within conference play now, so you've played a lot of really good opponents, we start to get a really good picture of like, hey, here's what's really working for the team, what's really not. And if you're a team that's kind of struggling to figure out what's going to lead to consistent success, oftentimes taking a look at that and sort of tweaking what you're doing can be really impactful.
And what is the lineup data kind of telling you about Duke this year? Because Duke has played so many different lineups so far, including many different starting lineups. So I'm wondering like what you're seeing there. Like, obviously I'm not going to ask you to be Coach Jon Scheyer here for a second, but like, is there any kind of low-hanging fruit you're seeing there that Duke could maybe kind of maximize by putting certain players together on the court even more?
Sure. Just pulling up a quick look at this. The best performing lineup of like the top. One of the things that's a problem with lineup analysis is that because you play so many different guys, the sample size, the amount of data that we can collect on these lineups is often not a lot outside of your top 5 to 10 lineups. So like Duke's most used lineup this year has played 176 possessions. That's probably 2.5 games of action. That's a pretty good amount of sample size to say like, we know how this lineup is doing. But like if you go to even down to their 4th or 5th most used lineup, it's played less than a full game of data. So you can learn from it, but you can't necessarily draw conclusions from it yet. With that being said, if I look at my lineup data, basically is looking at per possession, how well is this group of 5 playing on the court, adjusting for the level of competition that they've played. That's very important with lineup data because, your lineup could play great, but it's just against a really bad team, so it makes it look awesome. Everything I have with the lineup data is adjusted for who you've played on every single possession in terms of the opposing 5 players that you were against. So the lineup that has performed the best for Duke, adjusted for those opponent stats, is also the lineup that has played against the hardest level of opponent as well, which is really interesting. And that 5 is Caleb Foster, Isaiah Evans, Kemenya, Ngongba, and Boozer. I think in general that the 3 of Boozer, Evans, and Ngongba are going to be in most, if not all of these good lineups, but it's really those pieces around them. And it's the Foster and Kemenya group. And that is also the lineup that is predicted to be the best going forward as well for Duke. So there's not really a lot of lineups on here that are like bad in general, but that's the one that sticks out to me the most.
Yeah, when you're 17-1 and, top 3 in the metrics, obviously I would think most lineups are going to be good.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, I think too, and one time, I'll kind of circle around this a little bit. Like, I don't want to use the word like we see sometimes that coaches or programs or systems kind of break analytics. But I do think we find at times that they find little wrinkles or they get ahead of it. They find it a little bit. I'm speaking of Danny Hurley a few years ago, where just no one knew any idea how to stop that offense. Last year, Jon clearly found something with that offense and how they were able to get into that. For you, I'll give Jon a little bit of flowers here. Like, how impressive is it, or maybe not impressive is the right word, but to go from, you had Cooper Flagg, he was at the top of your rankings. You got Cam Boozer, he's at the top of your rankings. Two completely different guys, two completely different systems. If you could just maybe speak a little bit about, your impression of Jon and how he uses this kind of data to develop offensive systems to get this type of production.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think it's always a given that when you have the best or most talented or most productive player in the sport that you're going to be able to get the right amount of chemistry and pieces around that to really help the team excel. I mean, first of all, when you look at, both Cooper Flagg and Cameron Boozer last year and this year, they are even though they were asked to be the alpha on the team and to do everything for the team, also very unselfish players, and that they're very team first. And whether they're scoring 12 points or 30 points, you can really tell that their ego never gets above them. It's all about the team, right? And then when you throw in the other pieces, I just love what Duke has done the last 2 years in having players on the roster. You look at a guy like Malik Brown. And I even think Knippel was a great example last year of a guy who was like, he would have been a great first scorer on almost every other team in the country, but he did everything that Duke needed from him as a secondary or even tertiary guy at times because of the talent on that roster. And so everyone just plays within their role really well and knows how to make the team click. And so even though you look at the box score at the end and it's like, oh my goodness, Cameron Boozer had another 28 points and 14 rebounds. It oftentimes doesn't like punch you in the face like that because it doesn't look like he's trying to just like, okay, I'm the guy, I'm going to take over. It's all part of the offensive system. And so that is what's really impressed me the most, is just how they've been able to yes, find talented players, because that's really important, but also find the right talented players who have really fit what they're doing. And then, ultimately for this year, that has led to Cameron Boozer being, in my opinion, the best player in college basketball. I don't really think it's that close. I have him ranked as the best player overall in terms of my player value metric, best offensive player in the country, top 5 in defense, best overall statistical contribution. And when you look at his impact on team performance for Duke this year, the team is playing at its best more than any other player when Cameron Boozer's on the floor. They're outscoring opponents by almost 15 more points per 100 possessions when Boozer's on the floor than when he's on the bench. That's better than any other player on the team. That's what you love to see, is like he's putting the stats down, yes, but also like it's very meaningful. So it's just a stellar year for him, and that speaks to both him and his approach to this, but also the team makeup around him to allow him to succeed like that.
Yeah, and I know for sake of time here, I want to get into a few things. Something that's, I think, always been there, Evan. I'm sure you've went through it, and maybe you're just in a war room beating your head. We talked a lot about offensive metrics here. Defensive metrics still seem to have not really I don't know if they haven't caught up, or it's like you can't really maybe trust it or use it or interpret it the same way here. I guess for you a little bit, could you talk about that conundrum, and are we at a place where defensive metrics really mean anything, or how do you a good individual defender doesn't equate to team defense? What do you value more here? Just a little bit about where we're at on the defensive side of things.
I think generally speaking, it's always harder to measure defensive value or impact than it is offensive, because offensive box score stats just at face value can be a lot closer of a representation to how good of an offensive impact guy you are. They certainly don't do the full job, but they do a pretty decent job. On defense, if you want to boil it down to individual stats, you're basically looking at defensive rebounds, blocks, and steals. But that can often that often slants more towards bigs because they're getting more rebounds and blocks. And sometimes, great guards who are good on-ball defenders aren't necessarily guys who have their hands in the cookie jar a lot. So in general, looking at that stuff does that tell you who the best defenders are? Maybe not. But just because it's harder doesn't mean I don't think you should try and still pay attention to the best stuff that we have out there. So in my opinion, I think the best metric for measuring defense is what I have on my website in Bayesian performance rating. And the reason why is because basically the theory behind how it works on the defensive end is if you are truly a great defender, that means that when you are on the court, when you are playing on defense, you're having a great impact on your overall team performance. And so when you look across an entire season, if a guy is a good defender, regardless of whether he's counting a lot of defensive stats or not, he's going to have a positive impact on how the team is playing. And that's why the coach is putting him on the floor to play as opposed to having him on the bench. And so defensive BPR on my website basically accounts for that. It looks at, yes, how good are your blocks, your steals, your defensive rebounds, but also what kind of level of impact are you having defensively? And there are some guys who really stick out. I remember a couple years ago, Herb Jones at Alabama stuck out as one of the best defenders in the country in college. Not a lot of people were really paying attention to it. And then look what he ended up being in the NBA, one of the best, most important defensive impact guys. I remember, my metrics were really high on Mark Vidal at Baylor the year that they won, where he wasn't one of their top 3 offensive options, but everyone recognized that he was incredibly important for them in their defensive success. And those guys really stick out a lot in my metrics. And so that's something that I think is really important and I think is really useful. Even if you can't fully trust it blindly, it's still a really important thing to be paying attention to because it does more often than not tell you a good picture about whether a guy is being impactful or not on defense.
Yeah, nice. All right, I know we got to get you out of here. So last 2 questions, real quick hitters here. One, we'll do a player and then we'll do a team. Is there a player-based stat that you look at as the best like predictive stat of like future success, next level success? And then for the team one, is there a stat, a trend, or anything that you look at that might predict Final Four level or maybe something that most of these teams kind of had in common or something of that nature?
I feel like there's so many player stats to pick from. I don't actually have one, so I'm going to skip that one. But for the team, I think an interesting one, which we've not talked about, so this is a good double segue here, is the kill shot. So the kill shot is a metric that I track on my website of every time that a team goes on a 10-0 run in a game or they score 10 or more unanswered points. And I'll track every time a team does it during the season and every time that happens against them. And, this is something that Duke has been very good at the last several years. Jon Scheyer has even referenced this on the podium, talking about the kill shot. The thing that I've noticed with a lot of the best teams in the country, the teams that often go to Final Fours, win national titles, is that they are very good at not allowing 10-0 runs to be scored against them. What that means is that these teams, yes, they might have the ability to go on a scoring run at any moment, but they're very secure in not giving up a lead or giving up some sort of a close game quickly. And those are often the teams that end up being the most reliable and do really well in the tournament because basically you're not really at risk of just fumbling the game away. And if you are one of the best teams in the country, you're typically probably going to be a favorite or ahead in most games, and you're very safe with that lead. So that is something that I've often identified as being a very key stat that a lot of the best teams have done is not giving up many scoring runs against them in games. And so that's been really cool to see.
Yeah.
I've actually got one more thing for you. Maybe this will be too hard to answer off the top of your head, but do you think it is easier or harder now to win a title with the landscape being so top heavy? Because on the one hand, you have all these dominant teams, but on the other hand, there are fewer teams that are at that level, right? So it's not spread. So you're maybe less likely to get upset by a 10 seed, but you're more likely to have to go against another dominant team in the Final Four.
Yes. I think that probably evens out a little bit, if we're being honest. Like if it's easier to get past the first couple rounds, but harder later, it probably evens out. I think for me, the way I think about that question more is like, what teams, is it easier or harder to have continuous, consistent elite success every year? My opinion is that it's harder to do that because of the fact that the amount of money that teams have to spend each year seems to kind of have gone up and down a lot each year based on really how they did the previous year and whether the people supplying that war chest felt rewarded for their contribution. And so the top 5 teams in NIL one year are not the top 5 in the next year. And so for that reason, I think it can be a little bit more difficult than it was, say, 5-10 years ago. Just say like, hey, we are this program. We always get good players. We always keep good players. We don't have to worry about our players leaving. So in that sense, I think it's a little bit harder. But the teams that have still done it really well in the last 3 years are the ones who have really prioritized, keeping a hold of their good players from season to season. Duke has done a great job of this. Houston has done a great job of this. Purdue has done a great job of this. Florida, that's why they won the national title last year, is because they, had guys like Walter Clayton transfer there and then stay for multiple years. Guys like Will Richards, similar story. So I think the teams that are still able to stay elite each year are the ones who are saying like, hey, we really prioritize, giving resources and keeping our key contributors from year to year. And that's how we're going to continue to be elite every single year, rather than saying that's fine, we'll just retool with more good players, because that just means it's a lot more of a guessing game as to whether you'll get that right or not.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how this continues to track. We didn't even get into it, and we're not going to get into it here. But once we start adding the Charles Bediacos of the world, and maybe we'll get DJ Stewart back here at Duke at some point. Who knows, folks? It's getting a little wild out there. Evan, we appreciate it, man. Not that you really need our platform, but I know you got to get out of here. But just real brief, kind of plug anything you got going on. Talk a little bit about your new podcast. I know you just had Brazzello on there. Cam went first in your freshman draft there as well, so y'all check that out. But tell them what you got going on, what's on the radar.
I really appreciate it, guys. This was super fun. So all the stuff we've been talking about, you can find everything at EvanMiya.com, all the links to socials and all that. I did just launch a new weekly college basketball show called The Evan Miya College Basketball Show, and episodes are dropping every Tuesday morning. Literally just launched that a couple weeks ago. So I'm been really fun to get that off the ground. It is not just a hardcore analytics show. It's a show where we're talking about a lot of different national topics at various levels, a lot of really big, fun national guests. You mentioned Jeff Borzello from ESPN was on me with last week. John Fanta was on the week before. So it's been really fun so far. A lot more great guests come in. Would really appreciate any support, listens and follows and that sort of thing. So been really fun to get that going. And so I would hope people can check that out.
Yeah, for sure. Again, we appreciate it. Thanks for taking your time here with us. For you all, please rate, review, subscribe. Big winter storm coming in, so kind of stay warm in there. You can email us, TheDevilsDen.pod@gmail.com. You can find us on X/Twitter at DevilsDenPod247. Keep the faces strong and the verb high. Go Duke.